The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
And let's dig into how to run a consensus meeting. So what we want to do is talk about consensus meetings as a good opportunity to either uphold or abandon the principles of a fair, open, and transparent evaluation process. And let's talk about some of the pitfalls there that might be encountered. If that's the link you're talking about there, Roosevelt, let me know. Otherwise, let me know if you're looking for something different. All right, so agenda for this topic. We'll cover a few definitions, plural, and just come right out with some of our recommendations here from CPE. And then we'll dig into the details of 5 steps for an effective consensus meeting. We'll go through some pros and cons and examples of what we've seen in our experience. I hope all of you will share some of yours. We'll summarize things, close out, give you some announcements, and then open up to some discussion groups on this topic as well. But by way of definition or definitions plural, when it comes to what is a consensus meeting, the first thing we have to acknowledge is that there are really many different definitions out there. So it's not just one thing. It probably means a number of different things, even to the folks who are here in this audience. Probably a good chunk of you are each have your own internal mental conception of what a consensus meeting is that might conflict with others here on this very call. And that's okay. It reminds me of our session we did about a year and a half ago on best and final offers or BAFOs, where we went through 5 different definitions that are pretty common out there, all of which are either slightly or substantially different, pretty similar to consensus meetings here. So a whole bunch of different definitions of consensus meetings. As an example, some of the things that are most commonly different that we've seen in organizations out there would be a consensus meeting can be where evaluators get together and discuss their scores. Sometimes we're just discussing apparent discrepancies between evaluators in the scores rather than scores as a whole. So that's a minor difference there. Some organizations allow the consensus meeting process to for individual evaluators to change or adjust their scores if they had a mistake only. Others allow individual evaluators to change or adjust their scores if they have a new understanding or are persuaded by other evaluators as a part of the consensus discussions. Other evaluations say, no, you are not allowed to change your score whatsoever, but we're just getting together to talk about things and make sure everyone's heard, even though it doesn't have any mathematical difference on scoring and so forth. So there's a wide range of how people tackle that as well. You also have setups where individual evaluators will discard their scores, and the only thing produced from the consensus meeting is a single consensus score, and that's what's actually used by the client organization to do their evaluation. So essentially, the individual scores are just some draft workup content, and that's about all it is. And there's more. I'll pause here because I'm worried that I'm still maybe having some audio issues. I'm hearing nothing. So I was going to pause and open it up to the floor. Is there anything different that you've seen out there from a consensus meeting or challenges you've encountered? I'd be curious to get the audience to participate here and make sure I'm able to hear you all as well. Any takers? Or am I just stuck in silent world? My audio is okay. Thank you, Tim. Tim, you're not afraid to speak up. Do you mind going off the mute and just saying a few things so I can see if I'm hearing all of you?
You're talking to me. Tim Sage from Toronto.
Oh, I figured out my issue.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Now I hear you. It was an issue on my end. So, okay, cool. Did I miss anyone who was sharing about some differences with consensus meetings?
I was going to speak up.
Okay, go ahead.
Just so that you could hear.
Yes. I appreciate
those that you have there are what I have primarily seen. Although the agencies that I have worked for, we primarily do not do a single consensus score. We it has been one or the other. I have also worked at an organization that we do not have a consensus meeting. And the background on why those were stopped was because there was a senior director level person who was overly influencing. Yeah, that was the word. Basically said, either you give me back the response that I want, or I'm canceling the solicitation and we're going to award to who I say to anyway.
Yikes, yikes, yikes.
Yeah, and I know that that is true because I was in the room. So, right, I just saw Hamilton. I was in the room where it happened. Um,
Got you.
I did
And then,
report up, and then I no longer worked with that individual.
understood. Well handled. I assume the best you could. And then you said
Yeah.
that, Lynn, in scenarios where you do not have consensus meetings, how is that handled?
Oh, that was right, that came out of that. The way that so the individual evaluators do their evaluations, submit their scores, and then those scores then compiled and reported back out to the group so that determination of what the highest scoring proposal is still out there. It's just that there isn't any after evaluation conversation, unless, right, somebody were to say, they're like, oh, wait a minute, that looks really wrong to me.
Gotcha. There's this big
But
surprise that there was a
right.
good score for a particular vendor. They may have scored them lower or something like that.
Well, right, like if a particular vendor came back as the highest scoring proposer and 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 there was a and I'm no longer there, but if there was like a huge discrepancy in the scores, if there was one evaluator that scored a proposer, super high or super low,
Yep.
and also looking at their scoring right across proposers, if that was like out of character for how they were evaluating, right, then that would be, kind of called to question.
Got it.
And as in procurement, we would have taken that back to them and been like, is this what you really meant?
Got it. Got it. Okay.
Because
So
yeah,
basically
before,
you're using
yeah,
the combined, the average or
yeah,
however you're
yeah.
combining
Oh,
them.
yep,
And then if you see some type of discrepancy, something seems out of character, out of line with the
right,
justification, out of line with others, then procurement
yeah,
may dig into that and recommend a course of action as appropriate.
yeah,
Got
absolutely
it.
would dig into that.
Cool.
So yeah,
Love it. Love it. Well, great. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of variety and some
yeah,
downsides of, overly influencing and things like that. We'll talk about that. But just to use a really general definition here, and then I'll jump over to Mark's comment too. But for the purposes of today, what is a consensus meeting? It's some type of structured discussion or review where the procurement team and evaluation committee members come together and review, agree upon evaluation of supplier proposals. Most of the time what you'll hear, at least this is what ChatGPT told me, right? So it must be true, that the process is used to try to be more fair, to be more consistent, be more transparent in our decision making and all of that good stuff. So good motivators here, but a lot of nuance in the details. Mark chimes in and says, hybrid consensus where individual scorers supply their scores anonymously. They're compiled to see if consensus is already reached. In other words, and Mark, you're welcome to hop off of mute if you want, but I assume what you mean by if consensus is already reached, that's we get scores back from all those evaluators. The scores look pretty consistent. You don't see something where it's all over the place or there's a discrepancy. Then in that sense, you're like, hey, we already have consensus. In other areas, you may have some outlier, things like that. Tim's chiming in here too, saying if you arrive at a single consensus score, then that could be something that makes your debriefing more simple, I guess is the way to say it, right? Is here's the overall committee view that where we achieved consensus rather than individual evaluators, things like that. And there are definitely different rules at different public organizations about what materials are discoverable and subject to some of the open records requests and things like that as well. Okay, so typical consensus stuff, things that we typically see Each evaluator should independently score their proposals based upon whatever those predefined criteria were in the RFP for anything that the committee is being asked to score themselves. So that's okay. We kind of like that. It's the green highlight is if you're going to set up your evaluation committee, then the people that you've invited to that committee, you want their judgment, you want their input on the evaluation process. And so if you have them independently score, it's typically a good thing because they're not open to being swayed or persuaded, as Lynn had mentioned earlier, at least at the outset. Then, if you're doing some type of consensus process, there may be some type of meetup or discussion to compare scores, discuss discrepancies. This is more in that, red, pink, magenta, whatever color, trying to indicate not so good. That starts to give us some concern here at CPE if we're discussing things, comparing things, and so on, depending upon how it's done. Justification can be provided for different ratings. Justification is good. You want it to back that up. You want to help your debriefing process have some meat on the bones to support what the overall committee judgment was. Making adjustments there may be made to align and agree with standards. That kind of scares us. If we're changing things throughout the process, that can be talked about. The overall group reaches consensus on the final scores or rankings. That's both good and bad. I mean, so there's pro and con to this. For example, I think Tim gave one of the best reasons for a group consensus score being used that can simplify some things from a debriefing standpoint and open records requesting standpoint too. On the other hand, there is a view that the accountability of any individual evaluator goes down if we're relying upon overall group consensus, depending upon how you do your prep work and your setup. If you're having your individual evaluators truly independently score things up front and that's held fast and you require that to come in, then the lack of accountability is not such a big deal because you've had everyone actually chime in. In the worst of cases that we've seen, when evaluators know that they can just show up to the consensus discussion, sit back, relax, hear what everyone else is saying, kind of chime in and go along with the crowd, then we really start to lose some accountability there, and people can get by with not truly doing their homework. So again, it gets into how you are approaching the process itself. All right, so our overall recommendation here at CPE, just to come out and say it before we dive into some of the details here, is in general, we are not big fans of doing a consensus meeting. That doesn't mean we are against consensus as a whole. It's more of the meeting itself to get together, to talk about things, potentially adjust things, potentially exposed to influence like Lynn had shared. Those are the things that we don't like. And ultimately, it's a matter of efficiency. It could be a waste of time to get everyone together and have even more meetings. I know we all love even more meetings. And all of the things I'm showing here are frankly against core procurement principles of being fair, open, transparent, efficient, effective. So in general, what we would say is just use the average scores that come in, and that is in fact consensus. And by mathematical terms, it's truly the mathematical consensus. If you have other, weighted averages or things like that, I'm not getting into some of the details there and options, but basically, if you put together a good evaluation team and you have the appropriate and proper perspectives represented on that team on behalf of your organization, and you have a good solid evaluation process, Tim mentioned earlier, objective evaluation criteria, like all of that has to be factored in. Assuming you've laid that good foundation and groundwork and you've got a good committee and they've scored things and you put it together, then that is consensus. And just because one evaluator scores differently than the others, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have an unobjective criteria or things like that. Depends upon the perspective of that particular group. Are there wide ranges in perspective because of the type of end user that you have, things like that. But in general, we agree. I think Tim put that in the chat there as well. In general, you usually get very consistent scoring if you've got this good foundation back. But sometimes a discrepancy in that scoring, is okay. It just depends upon the perspective of that group that you've got involved in the evaluation process. They may be seeing only a certain part of that service or that technology or whatever, and they're chiming in from that particular perspective. And that's all well and good, and that's why things average together. So in general, that's what we recommend, but we do recognize that many organizations, quote unquote, have to. I'm using words like that, Tim. I'm not trying to say like their perspective in terms of how they're judging things, poorly or not. What I'm saying is, if depending upon the project type, it affects different areas of an organization differently. And so there can be vendors, services, and products that have relative strengths and weaknesses in different areas of the broader scope. And so in that case, there might be an internal user group that is not as pleased with the particular offering that other user groups might love. And that's just kind of how things can go. I didn't mean it in the sense of like we're making our judgments and being unfair and stuff like that. But all right, 5 steps. If you have to run a consensus meeting, if that's how you're doing it, here's ways to keep it simple, straightforward, and as effective as possible. So we'll go through 5 steps here of what we would recommend if you're doing these types of meetings. So number 1, I think this was mentioned earlier, is doing some quality checks on the scores that come in from your individual evaluators first. So I'm going to take the perspective of procurement here, who's helping to facilitate the process and getting everything coming back. So we're going to confirm first, right, that all of your individual evaluators have actually conducted their scoring. They've done their homework, in other words. They've entered their scores or their ratings. They've submitted their comments and justification. You've collected that up front. We're not going to walk into the consensus meeting and have those evaluators, drop their scores on the desk, so to speak. This is something that's going to be done ahead of time. If you're seeing things that are missing, things that look funky, we don't have good justification from the evaluators. If an evaluator says, I gave this a good score because I liked it, that's not objective. That's not very good justification. It is completely within your right in procurement to go back and say, hey, this isn't good enough. Please substantiate this better. That's just a silly example. Also doing some of those checks to make sure that the individual evaluator's score itself actually matches the justification, because sometimes mistakes happen and this is a good chance for you to check these things. And you want to do this ahead of time so that you're not wasting everyone's time during the consensus meeting itself. So I'll give you a quick example. Let's just imagine, for example, that you have this score sheet and you see these comments from your evaluator that says, hey, this is an outstanding approach, done something similar to our scope recently, good experience, yada, yada, yada. And then you look down at the bottom and you see that they gave a score of 10 out of 100 available points. Again, not saying that this is the perfect evaluation scale, but just to give you an example here, you look at this and you say, wait a minute, the comments up above were really positive. The score here is basically 10% of the total. Is it possible that this evaluator just forgot the extra 0 there and they meant to do 100? Let's go back and check and make sure all of this makes sense. That's kind of the simple things you might be checking for up front. Number 2, there's some prep work to do to set up for the meeting itself, the consensus meeting I'm meaning. So 1 is obviously there's some logistics. This has to be set up with your evaluators ahead of time, get a date set up. Ideally, you're scheduling this out even before you've released the RFP so that such internal events like this are completely matched and in sync with your overall procurement schedule. That way you're not scrambling later as well. You've got it all set up. Obviously, remind folks, get it on their calendars, get a hold, get the proper room, things like that. Remind them all the basic stuff, but sometimes it gets overlooked because it seems too simple, and then we're scrambling at the end. It depends upon your setup, but what we've mostly seen across all of North America and a bunch of different organizations is on average, consensus meetings last several hours. We've seen some that go crazy long. We've seen some be faster, and we're going to be arguing for more speedy, efficient meetings for sure if you have to do them. But we usually see it be a pretty decent time investment. So that there's that. Then reserving a room, make sure you got everything you need. That's all good stuff. Okay, number 3. Formatting the results. So this is a little bit of prep work that we recommend that you and procurement do prior to walking into that meeting. So let's say, for example, we've got, just completely made up, let's say we've got 10 evaluators, 4 different proposals, some different scoring going on here, and you've entered it all into a nice Excel sheet to summarize things. I mean, just look at how much more easily digestible the right-hand side over here above my head is, just because we've done some simple formatting in here. You could also go ahead and add the average in there to keep things more simple. You can color coordinate it like this, makes it even easier to see. There's different ways that you can do this that makes it digestible for when you get into that meeting itself. It's just easier for your evaluators to look at this and say, wow, looks pretty consistent, right? And then where do you want to spend your time in the discussion itself is maybe on these highlighted areas that are sticking out from other evaluators. So you might want to spend time there, right? So you've got a few scores here where this was firm 2 was overall a very poorly scored evaluation, but there's a few folks who had high scores. I mean, are they seeing something that the rest of us are not? Is that because of the perspective? And God, I'm not using the wrong term, not to set anyone off there, but are they the uses and scope areas within your organization that these 2 evaluators are representing? Is there something that they're seeing that is not pertinent to the rest of us that we may have missed? And same thing on firm 4. That might be where you spend some time discussing things. I'm looking here as an example of qualifications as one of the criteria. Maybe you switch over to another evaluation criteria, and we do recommend you go criteria by criteria in these discussions. And in that case, okay, we switch over to project approach, and here, there's some different scoring going on. I look at this, I'm like, okay, firm one, I've got really high scores. They're all pretty consistent, got the average. We really don't need to spend much time talking about this because, as someone in the chat said earlier, consensus has already, quote unquote, been achieved in a way. Over here, we've got a evaluator, Mike, who might be standing out differently from others. Is there something that Mike sees, or a perspective? I'm using that word again. Is there his representation of our organization? Is that something different there? Is there something we have to discuss, and so on? So there's that. Number 4, have the actual meeting itself. So when you go through the agenda of the consensus meeting, a few things to be aware of. So I'd walk through it up front with them, and procurement, usually your role here is what we're going to do is be the facilitators. We're going to make sure things are fair, things stay on topic, that there is not overly, there's no overexertion of influence and things like that. So you say, hey, look, we're going to go through, we've already done this prep work, steps 1 through 3 up front. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk as a group about some of the areas for large variations or discrepancies in scores. Someone gave a 20, someone else gave 100. We might discuss that and make sure there's no adjustments that are needed, make sure we're all aligned, make sure things are being done fairly and correctly. Show that per supplier, per criteria, and keep things focused. Typically try to discuss each supplier independently from the other supplier documents, so you're not getting into some big long conversation of pro and con, compare, contrast. So just make sure we're verifying our scores and that things are done correctly and fairly. You can open it up for discussions, but on a topic by topic basis, of course. Try to keep it focused, and let's discuss things like strengths and weaknesses of that particular document or criteria and keep it more streamlined like that. Of course, you have to make sure, as the facilitator or the fairness advisor of the discussion, make sure you have your overall objectives clearly stated. So for us, one of the things that we're always recommending people state is that we're not trying to pressure someone else to change their score. That is not okay. You need to be watching out for that influence that Lynn had mentioned earlier that can be exerted from one evaluator to another. I haven't gotten into the topic here of who should be on your committee and things like that, but an easy thing to think about there is if you have executives on the committee and you have some of their direct reports also involved, like that's an awkward situation, and that could lead to some unfairness depending upon how that leader is acting and behaving in those discussions. We want to acknowledge that evaluators do have a different perspective. They're usually chosen to represent different interests within the client organization. And so they may not have the exact same scores as other evaluators. That doesn't necessarily mean they're being unobjective or not being fair. It's because they might be representing a particular point of view within the organization, and that's what you want them to be looking out for and representing pros and cons on that behalf. Goal, want to make sure that no one's missed anything here. And are we going to allow folks to adjust? This is kind of a big check your policy, and how does that all work? Yes, you can allow evaluators to discuss strengths and weaknesses, but keep them on track. Don't let it go all over the place. Don't get it long-winded, things like that. And don't let folks jump ahead into other topics when you're trying to resolve something here and now on your agenda. The biggest things to watch for are these. Beyond the overall influencing side of things, I also watch out for these comments. Hey, well, the vendor's website says this. Or at a conference, I heard that. Or I heard from other clients this. All of these are big red flags because they're basically saying that the evaluator is considering content that is not contained within the proposals themselves. And that can get you into some really hot water really fast. And we need to be careful of that. Also, if something just doesn't feel right here, trust your instincts. You can stop the discussion on that particular point and move on from there. You can escalate that question. You can stop. You can, call up a manager or the rest of your team and say, hey, we're going to have to regroup on that particular point, but let's move on in this current meeting. In other words, you don't necessarily have to solve and resolve everything that comes up live in real time during that consensus meeting. If something just doesn't feel quite right, you can flag it and say, hey, I'm going to check on this, get some additional inputs, and make sure that we're following the best practices of our procurement policies here within our organization and report back to you all. That's okay. Sometimes we feel like we are being put on the spot to have a quick snap judgment and make a decision right there in the meeting, and that should never be the position that you are put in. You can just say time out on that. We'll get back to you as quickly as possible. Number 5, The last thing, of course, is achieving that final consensus in the scoring. So there's different ways to do it. You can show the overall average. You can obviously be reminding your evaluators of that rating scale. Make sure you get that final overall consensus score. That can be different things depending upon your setup, right? It could be that we're getting to a single overall score at the end. It could be that you're working up and having an average or weighted average of everything that was individually provided up front. There's different ways that folks do that. Another thing to keep in mind if you're doing consensus meetings is you probably have meetings plural. It's probably not one meeting. You know, a lot of RFPs will have an initial evaluation round for written proposals, and then you might have a short list prior to some type of interview or presentation or product demonstration or some combination thereof, in which case you may have another consensus meeting after that step of the evaluation too. So just keep in mind the overall time commitment that may be required if you're heading into consensus meetings. There's sometimes multiple steps there. So with that, a couple of quick examples to share. These are some of the ugliest examples we share on our Better RFPs class presented with our friends over at NASPO through Procurement U. We go through our worst examples, and they're pretty much what Lynn had said, that there are evaluators who try to lobby, who try to stall, who try to filibuster and try different tactics to get their way, and that can be a major challenge. So those are the biggest things that we watch out for. Other examples that are a little bit more typical when you're not getting such kind of in your face and negative influence going on, stuff that normally happens is like this. So this was a large software procurement. We had 7 evaluators. There were 9 major evaluation criteria that were scored by the committee. And in this case, the culture of this particular organization was, hey, we do want to have a consensus meeting, and they had a consensus meeting just for one of the 9 criteria of past performance. So thanks, Lynn. That was a prior professional life. It's not, not where you're at now. Noted. Topic number 1 they had here was just past performance, and this team spent 2 hours just talking about the past performance of the vendors here, which is in our minds pretty ridiculous in terms of the time commitment, right? It's a lot. So we had the initial evaluator scores came in. This was on a simple 1 to 10 scale. When they finalized things after their consensus discussion, it looked like this. So we had decimal point adjustments that they wanted to achieve after spending 2 hours in this meeting. And the question is it worth that 2 hours? And it's really not 2 hours. It's not the proper way to think about it. It's really 18 person hours when you add up the evaluators, the buyer. In this case, there was an observer here who was watching things too. I think someone asked that in the chat earlier of observers. And also, I've seen folks who have consensus meetings where it's open to the public. So that adds a whole nother layer of detail too. So we had basically 0 effect on the ratings themselves, but we wasted almost 20 hours of people's time. So in our mind, just not a great use of time. Another one, this is for a healthcare project, 5 evaluators, 7 major things scored. And they've got this, right? Initial versus final, there are differences here. And once again, very minor differences, almost 30 person hours of time. Again, just don't think this is a valuable use of people's time. Don't think it's having a mathematical difference. You're basically arguing over basic things. I don't even know if it's poorly written here. It's just that there was no change. Like, people sometimes like to get together and talk about stuff. That doesn't mean that the stuff they're talking about is wrong, but it might mean the people doing the talking are not so awesome on what they're talking about. So I think that's more of what I'm saying is, yeah, if you've got good criteria, you don't need to get together to talk about it. It's kind of a waste of time. You're almost trying to insert differences here, and that's a problem with how the people are approaching their evaluation mindset. Our recommendation is generally skip it, right? You're still using consensus even if you skip the meetings. We had this earlier of how we recommend folks do things, but individually, not discussing, make sure that people are feeling the accountability to perform on the evaluation committee and submit their scores. Of course, procurement, you still have the right to clarify things, to call out discrepancies, make sure justification is documented and everything is being fairly done. But in short, skipping the meeting, using your mathematical average with a good foundation of good criteria is a better way to go. As a quick, simple way of illustrating this, you look here and it's like, I look at firm 1, I see some consistent evaluations. I have an average here. Even some of these other scores as well. Like, is this not fair? Is it not transparent? Is it not pretty consistent here? So I would say generally, yes. And then my AI generated image of being caught between a rock and a hard place, which happens to be both rocks here. Thanks, AI. Sometimes we hear people make these arguments like, hey, don't worry, we're not going to use the consensus meetings to be changing all of our scores and things like that. But at the same time, what if somebody missed something? What if we need them to change their score because they missed something? And you're like, wait a minute, you can't have it really both ways here. We're a little bit talking out of both sides of our mouths. And here's something else I'm going to say, which may be a bit of a hot take for some of us here. But let's just go for it. What if an evaluator missed something? Well, that's not necessarily the evaluator's fault. It's not. It is not the evaluation committee's job to go and figure out differences between the quality of the proposals, offerings, and so forth. It is the supplier or proposer's responsibility to stand out from their competition and make things clear and justifiable themselves. So yeah, stuff happens. We are humans. It's possible that an evaluator misses something somewhere. Is that what's happening all the time? No, certainly not. And even if it does on occasion, is it truly a major, show-stopping problem? Maybe not. There's different ways that you can tackle that. So in summary, 5 steps on how to approach a consensus meeting. This is what we'd recommend if you have to do it. Summarizing things overall. Biggest thing is it should not be about trying to pressure other individuals on the committee to change their score and exert that influence. The goal might be to just make sure we're all seeing things consistently, give an opportunity for folks to chime in and discuss things, make sure nothing's been missed. Even if things were missed, not always the biggest of deals if you go back to the prior slides. Yeah, it can take some time to do this stuff, and sometimes you're doing multiple meetings to get through the different steps of your evaluation. So you can try to speed it up, be more efficient with formatting techniques, things like that, and just be mindful of people's time.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.